Our next speaker is Tessa. We're not going to cut her short, so you won't be shortchanged. We're getting towards the end of the day, and we've got plenty of time at the end, so there's not a problem. Tessa Caldecott, or Teresa Caldecott, is the eldest daughter of Stratford and Leonie Caldecott, who you will have heard of, I know. They are the founders of Second Spring and the Centre for Faith and Culture in Oxford. Tessa read theology at Durham and dabbled in antiquarian books and theatre before joining the family business as manager. At the centre, she oversees the practical side of organising summer schools in English Catholic history and literature and editing the Magnificat magazine that you will have come across. That's for the UK and Ireland. And the various projects of Second Spring Books. She has also been an unofficial advisor to the GK Chesterton Library Trust that we spoke about earlier, and its social media coordinator since the collection moved from the centre to the Oxford Oratory last summer that Father Jerome told us about. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Tessa to come and speak to you.
Thank you. So I'm here on behalf of my father, Stratford, who will be known to many of you. He is too ill to attend, although he would have loved to have been here. He was diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer nearly 3 years ago. As well as the various projects just mentioned by Martin, I'm also involved in our flagship journal, Second Spring. I left a couple of copies of our economy issue. There's only one left, apparently, but yeah, whoever's fastest can get to it. But yes, do look it up if you haven't got a copy. It's the issue in which we come out of the closet as distributists, so I'm sure you'll find it very exciting. Not that we were really in the closet, but you know. I also wanted to mention that I'm, through the Centre for Faith and Culture, I'm also helping to organise a series of interfaith colloquii to bring together Christian and Islamic thinkers to engage in a conversation about notions of social philosophy, the secular, and the human vocation, which is a very interesting project and greatly influenced by Chesterton and the Catholic Land Association, which, in fact, the Islamic scholars we're working with are very, very interested in, and so we felt it was a very worthwhile common project to pursue. So feel free to ask me about that later or keep an eye on our website. And yes, I just want to reiterate, do take a flyer about the library. We've just set up in the new home, and it's one of the, after the collection that's here at St. Teresa's, it's one of the foremost, most important native centres of Chesterton scholarship in the country. So we hope that it will be used as a resource for everyone. And yes, we're trying to spread the word a little. Okay, well, thank you. With that introduction over, here is the talk by my father. I'm pretty sure that G.K. Chesterton is in heaven, and that in that sense a saint. But of course, he is not officially canonized. Prayer cards are circulating, thanks to the American Chesterton Society and others. However, there is one good reason to discourage this activity on behalf of St. Gilbert. By all means, let us pray for his intercession and draw attention to his holiness, but it would be regrettable if the campaign for his canonization were to draw attention away from his intellectual critique of modernity and his proposals for an alternative way of living. Chesterton is often thought of as an amusing journalist and a man of letters, a literary critic and novelist, but he was also many other things besides, among them an artist, a poet, a playwright, a philosopher, and a theologian. Gilson praised him as a Thomist, while Ian Carr regards him as a worthy successor to Newman as a Christian apologist. A recent book called G.K. Chesterton, London and Modernity presents him as a sophisticated commentator on the urban environment. His views on modernity and on reality itself have been widely quoted, and he is an influence on a surprisingly wide range of thinkers, including Marshall McLuhan, Ivan Illich, Antonio Gramsci, René Girard, S.R.L. Clarke, Slavoj Žižek, and John and Alison Milbank. But what was his critique of modernity, and what was the alternative he proposed? And what, to start with, is modernity in any case? There seem to be numerous answers to this question. One involves a man with a large moustache, whose name, like many of those I have just read out, when correctly pronounced, sounds like a sneeze, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's life ended in the year 1900, a date easy to remember, 3 years after St. Therese of Lisieux. Nietzsche's most famous line is, "God is dead," and as a philosopher, along with Kant and Hegel, and further back perhaps Descartes, he was the father of modern continental thought. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to give a complicated, eyeball-glazing summary of modern philosophy. Reading modern philosophy leads us into a swamp or archipelago of alternative views. Nobody really knows what is true or even what is truth. Most philosophers don't care anymore. Pope Benedict therefore spoke of the tyranny or dictatorship of relativism. Relativism, of course, is the belief or assumption that there is no absolute truth, or if there is, no one knows what it is. This easily filters down to the unwashed masses like us. Just as in previous ages, most people assumed the experts, let's say the priests, had all the answers. So today, people assume the experts, let's say in this case the scientists, have the only answers worth knowing. The difference, and it is an important difference, because it is the difference between modernity and what went before, is that today we assume that the answers the experts have are worth knowing not because they are true, but because they give power, and by which I mean power over the world through technology. If it works, it must be true, or at least, it must be true in the only sense worth knowing. The idea of absolute truth is discarded as a fantasy. Chesterton would have none of this. Just as one generation could prevent the very existence of the next generation by all entering a monastery or jumping into the sea, so one set of thinkers can in some degree prevent further thinking by teaching the next generation that there is no validity in any human thought. It is idle to talk always of the alternative of reason and faith. Reason is itself a matter of faith. It is an act of faith to assert that our thoughts have any relation at all to reality. To reality at all. There is a thought that stops thought. That is the only thought that ought to be stopped. That is the ultimate evil against which all religious authority was aimed. It only appears at the end of decadent ages like our own. Chesterton wrote this a few years after Nietzsche's death, in Orthodoxy. God may have been dead, but human thought and common sense were still alive in G.K. Chesterton. The thought that stops thought is the philosophy of relativism. If you are a relativist, you aren't trying to reach the target, which is truth. You will settle for anything that serves your purpose or that sounds plausible. There is no reason to go further, since there is no absolute truth to attain or achieve. May as well stay where you are. It also means that faith, religious faith, cannot make contact with or gain entry to the human soul. The problem is that faith offers the answer to a question modern man is unable to ask. This is the real danger at the heart of modernity, the separation of reason from faith, of nature from the supernatural. God is out of the picture. That is what John Paul II's philosophical encyclical Fides et Ratio was about. As Chesterton writes in The Thing, all human beings, without any exception whatever, were specially made, were shaped and pointed like shining arrows for the end of hitting the mark of beatitude. According to Chesterton and the great tradition, nature was made for grace and the human mind for truth. But modern man is made for whatever he can get. And that leads not just to relativism, but to consumerism. Chesterton lived long enough to see the First World War, but not the Second. It was the first that marked the end of the Edwardian era and the beginning of modernity. This was a war of machines, of guns and tanks and poison gas and bombers. Tolkien described it in The Fall of Gondolin, having survived, as Chesterton's brother did not, a brief time in the trenches. GKC lived into the interwar period, and with his prophetic instinct saw emerging a coming peril, more dangerous than any earthly dictator. A civilization based on an ever more intense cycle of production and consumption, destroying all hope of an interior life. We call this consumerism, or a consumerist society, a society built on economic growth measured in such a deceptive fashion that it appears to be both successful and inevitable. Until the crash, that is. This is a society built on usury, on credit and debt, and it is now global, so there can be no escape from it. Chesterton also saw that the next great heresy to undermine civilized existence is simply going to be an attack on morality, and especially on sexual morality. And it is coming not from the few socialists surviving from the socialist Fabian society, but from the living, exultant energy of the rich resolved to enjoy themselves at last, with neither popery, nor Puritanism, nor socialism to hold them back. The madness of tomorrow is not Moscow, but much more in Manhattan. If a man is an animal with no supernatural dimensional purpose, then entertainment can be his highest expectation, if he can afford it, and sexual indulgence being the most exciting form of entertainment, the present slide into decadence is equally predictable. Chesterton's insights are still valid and require our attention. The human mind is still made, as he writes in his book on Aquinas, to eat the strange, strong meat of reality. There are suggestions in his writings as to how we might start to plant the seeds of a new civilization, one that will grow and flourish in the ruins of the great crash to come. Those suggestions are found mainly in his writings on distributism. They are based on a common sense that is no longer common, on a philosophic realism rather than relativism, on personalism rather than individualism, on the importance of the family and chastity, on respect for nature instead of short-term exploitation, on tradition, religious freedom, respect for life, and the common good. Chesterton recognized that heart and hearth, work and worth are all of a piece. Human flourishing is found in families, human wholeness in holiness. Civilization depends on faith, faith both in the transcendent horizon that many call God, but also faith in reason and in the ability of human intelligence, with the assistance of grace, to grasp objective truth. Man is a paradox, a partly supernatural animal, and he possesses both an inside and an outside. Of these two, the inside is the most important, for it opens up towards the infinite. But modernity, ever since the masters of suspicion, Darwin, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche accomplished their work, suppresses and denies the interior, reducing man to an animal or an economic unit, driven entirely by physical desires. Chesterton knew where this unique and potentially lethal civilization we call modernity came from. It grew in the ruins of Christendom and nourished itself on what was left of the Gothic civilization. Again, in The Thing, one of his most useful books on this topic, he writes, "The fact is this, that the modern world, with its modern movements, is living on its Catholic capital. It is using and using up the truths that remain to it out of the old treasury of Christendom, including, of course, many truths known to pagan antiquity but crystallized in Christendom. The forces of destruction were several. Henry VIII was one, with his dissolution of monasteries dedicated to three vital things: prayer and the interior life, the wise cultivation of the land, and hospitality to the poor. In our Oxford Summer School each year, we study this process in some detail. The liberation of capital by the dissolution made possible the Industrial Revolution, while at the same time creating a class of exploited workers that cried out for communism. Meanwhile, the Reformation, stemming from Martin Luther's campaign against the Catholic Church, led to the destruction of the philosophic realism that was the only secure foundation for human reason. It also led to a rising mood of individualism that drew to itself the humanism of the Renaissance and expanded across the world in the age of exploration, which soon turned into an age of colonialism, slavery, and genocide. The reaction to this process, that is, to the destruction of the old world and the birth of modernity, is also of great interest. We tend to call it Romanticism, and Chesterton was a late blossom on that tree. The Romantics, however, tended to rely on their feelings and emotions instead of their intelligence, whereas Chesterton combined both The Romantics looked at the modern industrial world with its dark satanic mills, William Blake, of course, and hated it. They tended, like the Pre-Raphaelites, to prefer the Middle Ages, with its arts and crafts. Chesterton did too, but he wasn't blind to the defects of the old civilization, and preferred, at least some of the time, to look not backwards but forwards, to a society in which Catholicism had been restored, and families lived according to the humane principles laid out by Pope Leo XXIII and his successors. The Romantics, Ruskin, I think, said, loved the Gothic and wanted every part of the cathedral except the altar. They liked the beauty but not the truth. For Chesterton, you couldn't have one without the other. It is worth spending some time studying the basis of these ideas and trying to apply them if they prove to be true. If a campaign for Chesterton's canonization gets in the way of that, then I would regret it. But it may be that it would not. Perhaps it would draw more attention to the ideas of this potential saint rather than less, because his works must then be searched and studied for possible heresy. If so, then this objection vanishes. And I hope that it would be the case, because Chesterton was not just an intellectual. He was not even just a prophet. He was a man of kindness and good humour, and, I have no doubt, heroic virtue. I, for one, intend to continue praying for his intercession. I think I'll end there. Thank you.